I know what many of you are probably thinking. Here we go again. Another frost alert. Another burst of cold air. Another warning to cover the tomatoes, check the fruit trees, and protect anything tender outside. But there is a reason this particular cold spell deserves more attention than it might appear to at first glance. Another major temperature swing is developing across the Midwest and Northeast, and by late this week, a noticeable cooldown could once again bring frosty mornings to parts of the region. At first, there appears to be one encouraging detail. Temperatures are not expected to fall quite as dramatically as they did during some of the previous cold outbreaks. That sounds like good news. And under normal circumstances, it probably would be. But this is not happening under normal circumstances. To understand why, you have to look at what has already happened. The first cold surge of May sent temperatures down to 28 degrees or lower across parts of the Dakotas and western Nebraska. Frost stretched much farther south and east, reaching areas of the Ohio Valley and even portions of the northern Texas Panhandle. Then came the second surge only days later, bringing another widespread period of below-average temperatures across much of the eastern half of the United States. And now, another round is moving in. Frost is once again possible across portions of the Midwest and Northeast late this week. The temperatures themselves may not look extraordinary on a weather map, but they are arriving after plants have already endured repeated cold stress. They are arriving after unusually warm April weather pushed apple orchards into bloom 2 or even 3 weeks earlier than expected. They are arriving after gardeners throughout the Ohio Valley planted tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and other warm season crops during April warmth because it looked as though winter had finally lost its grip. That is what makes this situation different. Spring across the northern United States is always a battle between retreating winter air and strengthening summer warmth. Nobody expects temperatures to rise smoothly from March into June. There are always reversals. There are always chilly mornings. But the scale and frequency of the swings this year have made the transition especially disruptive. Calling them several setbacks almost feels too gentle. This year began with a January polar vortex displacement that caused deadly cold and billions of dollars in damage. Then came extraordinary warmth in March. April followed with another surge of unusually high temperatures, immediately followed by hard freezes. May has now produced repeated cold waves, striking vegetation that had already been pushed well ahead of schedule by the warmth. And another cold push is now approaching. Today is Friday, May 8th, 2026. The third major frost threat of May is closing in, and the biggest concern is not necessarily the strength of this single event. The concern is everything that this event is landing on top of. Before we look at where the greatest risks are this weekend, it is worth stepping back and looking at the temperature pattern that has shaped this entire spring. Because when these events are viewed separately, they can look like ordinary episodes of spring weather. When you place them together, a much different picture appears. Following stretches of warmth that felt more appropriate for July or August, temperatures surged across parts of the mid-Atlantic before a strong cold front crossed the country. In some places, daytime conditions that felt almost like midsummer were followed by nighttime temperatures more typical of late winter. Some locations experienced temperature changes of 50 to 60 degrees in only 24 to 48 hours. Think about that. One afternoon feels like June or July. Within a day or two, the thermometer is behaving as though March has returned. That is more than a simple seasonal transition. It is temperature whiplash, and it has happened repeatedly this spring. Each cold episode has been relatively short. Temperatures fall sharply, remain cold for perhaps 1 to 3 days, and then rebound. On paper, that may seem preferable to a prolonged freeze. But short does not mean harmless. In fact, brief but damaging has become one of the defining patterns of these cold waves. The reason involves what happens inside the plants themselves. Imagine a plant surviving a marginal frost event around 33 degrees. It may still look healthy the following morning, but that does not mean nothing happened. Ice can begin forming in spaces between plant cells. Cell membranes can be stressed or damaged. Water regulation becomes less efficient. Photosynthesis can temporarily decline. Then the weather warms again. During the following days, the plant begins trying to repair itself. New tissue develops, damaged cells are replaced, fresh shoots emerge. But that new growth can be extremely tender. In some cases, tissue recovering from the first frost may actually be more vulnerable to the next cold night than the plant was before the original freeze. Then the second cold wave arrives. Now the plant is no longer entering the event in perfect condition. Some tissue has already been damaged. Some of the new growth has not hardened. The temperature required to create serious injury may therefore be slightly higher than it would have been before. A night at 34 or 35 degrees that might have caused little trouble earlier in the season can become far more consequential when the same plant has already endured multiple cold shocks. And now we are approaching another round. Vegetation across parts of the Midwest and Northeast may be entering this frost threat after experiencing 2 previous cold episodes in roughly 10 days. That is why cumulative cold injury matters. It is not simply the lowest temperature recorded on one particular morning. It is the repeated stress placed on the same developing tissue over and over again. And some of the areas in the path of this week's cold happen to overlap with extremely important agricultural regions. Start with the fruit belt. Apple, peach, and cherry orchards across Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia deserve particularly close attention. Warmth earlier this spring accelerated development in many orchards. Blossoms appeared ahead of their typical schedule, and in some places the trees have now moved beyond flowering into the fruitlet stage, where pollinated blossoms have already begun developing into tiny fruits. That stage offers somewhat greater cold tolerance than an open blossom, but it certainly does not eliminate the danger. Developing apple fruitlets can still suffer severe damage during a hard freeze near or below 28 degrees. Even temperatures closer to 30 or 32 degrees can produce partial injury, particularly when the fruit has already been exposed to previous frost events. And partial damage creates its own economic problem. Suppose an orchard loses 40% of its developing fruit. The farmer does not suddenly eliminate 40% of the season's operating costs. The remaining crop still has to be irrigated. Equipment still has to run, fuel still has to be purchased. Workers still have to maintain the orchard and eventually harvest the surviving apples. The cost structure remains largely intact while the amount of fruit available for sale declines. That can make partial crop loss financially brutal. Then there are vineyards. The Finger Lakes, the Hudson Valley, Virginia wine country, and the Lake Erie grape-growing corridor are all areas where growers have been watching frost risk closely. Grapevines that survived previous cold nights may now have several inches of fresh shoot growth. If primary buds were damaged during earlier freezes, some vines may already be relying more heavily on secondary or tertiary buds. Those backup buds can keep a vine alive and productive, but they often carry lower yield potential. Another frost event does not therefore arrive on a blank slate. It arrives on vines already adjusting to earlier damage. For some vineyards, this next episode may determine how much fruit remains available for the 2026 vintage. Vineyard managers who have already spent nights protecting vines from the first and second cold waves may once again find themselves watching temperatures hour by hour. And the threat is not limited to commercial agriculture. Home vegetable gardens across the Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast are facing essentially the same problem on a smaller scale. Many gardeners planted early because April felt unusually warm. Tomatoes went into the ground. Peppers were transplanted. Basil came outside. Cucumbers, eggplants, beans, and squash were planted because the weather seemed weeks ahead of schedule. Some of those plants survived the first cold wave. Some made it through the second. But a plant surviving a frost is not necessarily an undamaged plant. A tomato that has already endured 2 cold nights may have weakened tissue, damaged leaf margins, slowed root development, or a stressed growing point. Asking that same plant to survive another frost event is very different from exposing a healthy, hardened transplant to one chilly morning. Timing matters as well. If a tomato loses its main growing tip in March, there may be plenty of time for recovery before the productive part of the season begins. If the same damage occurs around May 10th, after the plant has already spent weeks developing roots and canopy growth, that lost time becomes much more important. Recovery means delay, and delay can mean reduced production later in the summer. The northern plains remain another area of concern. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Minnesota, and surrounding areas have repeatedly dealt with freeze conditions this spring. Temperatures in some locations have dropped into the upper 20s or hovered near the freezing mark. And yes, parts of the Dakotas could once again be dealing with temperatures near the upper 20s. Winter wheat is one crop being closely watched. As wheat reaches the jointing and boot stages, the growing point becomes much more vulnerable to freeze injury. Damage at this point in development can eventually appear as reduced head formation, sterile florets, or lower yield. The important issue once again is accumulation. The first freeze stresses the crop. The second arrives before complete recovery. The third adds another layer. When harvest begins in June and July, some of the effects of these repeated spring cold waves may finally become visible in yield numbers and crop condition reports. But there is also a genuinely interesting piece of hopeful news emerging from this difficult spring. Researchers and agricultural companies are experimenting with new ways of shielding crops from sudden spring freezes. One of the more unusual approaches involves foam. Yes, foam. Not a greenhouse, not a giant wind machine, not traditional overhead irrigation. Protective foam. The idea involves applying a lightweight biodegradable insulating material around vulnerable plants or plant tissues before temperatures fall. The foam creates a temporary thermal barrier, reducing the rate at which warmth escapes from the area surrounding the vegetation. Conceptually, it works somewhat like a layer of snow. Snow can protect vegetation because trapped air provides insulation and slows heat loss. A protective agricultural foam attempts to create a similar effect without requiring an actual snowfall. The technology is still being tested and is not something most farmers can simply purchase and deploy across thousands of acres tomorrow. But the fact that these systems are being developed at all says something important about the challenge growers are now facing. Temperature volatility is no longer only a weather story. It is becoming an agricultural technology problem. Farmers have traditionally relied heavily on average frost dates, seasonal planting windows, wind machines, irrigation row covers, and other established techniques. But when extremely warm periods are followed rapidly by renewed freezing temperatures, old assumptions become much less comfortable. For home gardeners, the technology may be different, but the physics remain almost identical. The objective is simple: slow the loss of heat around the plant. Frostcloth does it. Row covers do it. Cold frames do it. Even an overturned bucket over a small seedling can help if it traps some of the warmth stored in the soil overnight. The goal is to create a protected microclimate around vulnerable vegetation before temperatures reach their lowest point. And that brings us to one of the most damaging features of this entire spring pattern: the movement from 80-degree warmth to frost within only a few days. Why is that worse than simply having a cool spring? Because plants adapt to sustained cold. When temperatures remain chilly for long periods, vegetation maintains physiological defenses known collectively as cold hardening. Cells adjust, water content changes, plant membranes respond. Growth remains slower, but the tissue can become much better equipped to tolerate freezing temperatures. Warm weather reverses that preparation. When plants spend several days in summer-like warmth, cold hardiness begins disappearing. And this spring did not merely bring mild warmth. Parts of the eastern United States experienced temperatures resembling midsummer. Philadelphia reached around 91 degrees during the April heat. Baltimore climbed to roughly 93. At those temperatures, a plant does not behave as though winter might return in 3 days. It behaves as though the growing season has arrived. New shoots emerge rapidly. Blossoms open, leaves expand, fruit begins forming. Cold hardening mechanisms fade because biologically the plant is receiving an unmistakable message from the environment: summer conditions are here. Then the temperature falls. 30 degrees arrives only days after 90. The newly developed tissue has almost no preparation for that reversal. That is why the sequence matters so much. The frost is dangerous, but the warmth immediately before the frost helps create the vulnerability. The plant is essentially encouraged to lower its defenses just before cold air returns. This is the mechanism behind the destructive 8-0S to frost roller coaster. Spring is always a tug of war between winter and summer, but this year the rope is being pulled unusually hard in both directions. The pattern began with severe winter cold, shifted rapidly into exceptional spring warmth, accelerated vegetation across enormous areas of the country, and then repeatedly sent cold air back over landscapes that had already moved into active growth. That sequence is why average last frost dates also need to be understood correctly. Every year when frost appears in May, someone looks at a calendar and says, "But our last frost date has already passed." That date is not a guarantee. It is a statistical guide based on historical observations. Depending on how the date is calculated, reaching an average last frost date does not mean freezing temperatures are now impossible. It simply means the probability has declined compared with earlier in the spring. Late cold snaps can still happen, and when the atmospheric pattern is unusually volatile, relying on a single calendar date becomes even more risky. If your region experienced unusual warmth and you planted early, frost protection should remain close at hand even after the traditional planting window begins. Keep the row covers, keep the frost cloth, keep the cloches or cold frames available. Do not assume 1 week of summer-like temperatures means the cold season is permanently over. Soil temperature deserves attention as well. This is something that gets far less discussion than overnight air temperature. Frost advisories tell you whether leaves and blossoms may freeze. Soil temperature tells you whether warm season plants are actually ready to establish strong roots. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and other warm season crops can struggle when transplanted into cold soil, even if the leaves never experience a true frost. After repeated temperature reversals, soil conditions across the Ohio Valley and Northeast may vary considerably. Some locations warmed substantially during April. Others have repeatedly cooled during the following cold surges. A garden can therefore escape frost damage and still have plants that remain stalled because their roots are sitting in soil that is simply too cold. Now let us get practical, because the important window is the next 24 to 36 hours. If you have vulnerable warm season vegetables in the ground anywhere across Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, or parts of New England, be ready to cover them before sunset if your local forecast calls for frost. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, squash, beans, basil. Any tender vegetation that cannot tolerate frost should be protected before temperatures fall. Frost cloth and commercial row covers are ideal, but they are not your only options. Old bed sheets can provide protection, buckets can protect individual seedlings, plastic can also be used, but it is better if it is supported above the foliage rather than resting directly against delicate leaves. Whatever you use, Put it in place before the coldest air arrives. Do not wait until you look outside and see frost. Once visible frost is formed, temperatures near the plant surface have already been low enough for damage to begin. And check the forecast for your specific county. Not simply your state, not simply the Midwest, not even just your nearest large city. Frost is remarkably local. Cold air settles into valleys and low-lying terrain. Urban areas can remain several degrees warmer because pavement and buildings retain heat. Lakes can modify nearby temperatures. Elevation differences can determine whether one neighborhood sees 31 degrees while another remains at 36. The boundary between damaging frost and harmless chill is rarely a perfectly smooth line. That is why county-level National Weather Service frost advisories and freeze warnings matter. For orchard managers, there is another important job to do before the next cold event arrives: determine how much damage already exists. Inspect developing fruitlets from the previous frost waves. Cut samples open. Look for browning inside the seed or embryo area, which can indicate tissue killed by freezing temperatures. Understanding the existing damage percentage matters for several reasons. It helps with crop insurance documentation. It influences thinning decisions. It changes irrigation and management strategies. And most importantly, it tells you how much additional damage the orchard can absorb before the season becomes economically difficult. For growers across the northern plains, the same principle applies. Continue monitoring sensitive crops and winter wheat for signs of cumulative injury. If temperatures near 29 degrees are forecast in your area, protect any outdoor plumbing that could be vulnerable, cover newly transplanted seedlings, and closely inspect wheat that has reached sensitive developmental stages. So where exactly do things stand right now? It is Friday, May 8th, 2026, and another cold wave is approaching for the weekend. The latest frost outlook indicates that temperatures across parts of the Midwest and Northeast will fall enough to create frosty mornings in some areas. There is one piece of good news. This event is not currently expected to be as severe as the hardest freezes seen during the earlier cold waves. That distinction matters. There is an enormous difference between widespread temperatures of 27 or 28 degrees and a marginal frost event with readings in the low or middle 30s. Healthy vegetation that remains somewhat cold-hardened can often survive the latter without major problems. But the key word there is healthy. The vegetation facing this weekend's cold has already lived through an extraordinary spring. Some plants were pushed rapidly into growth by record warmth. Some were hit by the first freeze. Some survived the second. Some are currently trying to replace damaged tissue. And now the atmosphere is asking them to endure another abrupt reversal. That cumulative stress may ultimately become one of the most important agricultural stories of this spring. It receives less attention than tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, or wildfires because frost is quiet. There is no dramatic wall cloud. There is no towering plume of smoke. There are no spectacular radar images. A frost event simply arrives after midnight. The wind may be nearly calm. The sky may be perfectly clear. Nothing looks dangerous. Then morning comes, sunlight reaches the garden, and the tomato plant that looked healthy the night before begins turning dark, limp, and collapsed. That is how this kind of damage happens. Quietly. So cover vulnerable plants before tonight's temperatures fall. Check young fruit tomorrow morning. Watch the frost advisory or freeze warning status for your county through the weekend. And remember that this event is part of a much larger pattern. From the January polar vortex to extraordinary March warmth, from April's summer-like temperatures to repeated May cold waves, the atmosphere has moved rapidly between extremes again and again. The roller coaster has not stopped simply because people are tired of riding it. Another cold dip is approaching. The frost threat is real. The vulnerability created by everything that happened before it is real. And for anyone with tender vegetation outside, the best opportunity to reduce that risk comes before the temperature falls tonight. Protect the garden. Check the orchard. Keep watching your local forecast. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next update.